All right, we are here with Ted Wueste. Ted, thank you for joining us. You preached this Sunday at the church, and I have to say on the front side, you mentioned that you have 3 seminary degrees while you were preaching. So you have immediately upped our seminary degree count on this podcast to 3. So
That's totally true.
Oh, that's great. Well, one for each of us, right?
there you go. One. Yes, I will. Yeah. Jason and I will take credit for one each of your seminary degrees.
I'll
Please
take
do.
I'll take the
Yeah,
doctorate.
I feel kind of, after I said that, it wasn't in my notes or anything. I felt kind of weird, like, oh man, that's kind of maybe didn't sound quite right, but I hope it illustrated the point of, information and theological study was not uh, adequate in a sense.
Yes, it did. Yeah.
It
That was,
really did. No, it
yeah.
really did. And actually, before you even said that, I actually thought, oh man, I should have mentioned, not that I don't think you need credentials mentioned, but I think I meant to talk about how you got to where you got, and I was trying to get you up there quicker. But then when you said it, I was like, good. I'm glad you actually mentioned that. So, because I think it is important, like when we're talking about things like a whole book of the Bible, especially when like the Song of Songs, I think it's helpful for people to know, like, hey, you're not just making this up because you know, you got a flyer in the mail one day and you're like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I guess we'll just go with this. You've actually studied it, like you can speak into it. So anyway, I thought that
Well,
was totally fine.
yeah, and and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but I preached a whole sermon series, an 8-week sermon series on the Song of Solomon, probably about I don't know, 15, 16 years ago. And it was very different than how I understand the Song of Solomon today. And maybe not, yeah, I would say differently. So hopefully there's always room to grow in our understanding of the scriptures, understanding of who God is and how he works in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, God is inexhaustible. So, and the scriptures are, one of the things that I always think is the day that I think I have the scriptures really figured out is the day I'm in serious trouble because there's just too much there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's just too much to God to feel that way. So,
Mhm.
but nonetheless, you kind of walking us through, big picture, I guess probably 40,000 foot level look at the Song of Songs was great this Sunday. Super helpful. I mean, no offense, Jason, but I took a lot more notes than I normally do, which is awesome. And
Well,
lots of good stuff.
that's because he has 3 seminary degrees.
Well, this is
That's
true. Yes. Well, even like the illustration of the hidden driveway ahead and connecting that to hidden God ahead. Yesterday and today I've been thinking about that. Oh, hidden God. Let me be reminded of the love of God as I go about my work day, which is, for me, very busy, very demanding. So super helpful stuff there. But we want to get into some of these questions that we had here that Jason and I put together. One of them just being about the Song of Songs as a whole and the idea of reading the book, understanding this song, and call it a book, but this song metaphorically. And some people would say that we should never understand this book metaphorically as it relates to the people of God and Jesus. So help us understand, why we can and should read it both as a text about marital intimacy and intimacy with the Lord. Help us understand that dynamic.
Yeah, and it's a really important question. And I can start by saying that that's what I was taught all throughout my seminary training was, in fact, one of my primary professors when I was completing an MDiv did his master's thesis on Song of Songs and made it very clear to us that it was not talking about our relationship with God. He was like, no, this is only talking about human relationship. And so that really stuck with me for a long time. I mean, he almost like he scared us to death, I guess you
Yeah,
could
I
say, to
bet.
see it any other way. So I was very shaped by that understanding. But then as I just continued on in my journey with Christ, I began to read things and like just in a broader way, reading the way that the church fathers understood the Song of Songs and understanding that if you go back to the Jewish understanding of the Song of Songs, and even in a lot of ways how they understand it today, um, there was always layers to how they were understanding the Song of Songs. And many people have argued that if it wasn't talking about our relationship with God, it would have never made it into the Bible. If it was purely
That's a good
about
point.
human sexuality, why would that be in the Bible? Not that the Bible doesn't speak about human sexuality, um, but you go back to the first century, and one of the prominent rabbis said, the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies when you come to the scriptures. In the Jewish Seder meal, there became a tradition that you would go through the whole Seder meal, and at the end of it, the rabbis would read the Song of Songs. And the reason was that the rabbis were noticing that people were getting stuck in the history of their redemption and the history of the Exodus. And they wanted to read the Song of Songs to remind people why they had been delivered. And it was for this deep, intimate, loving relationship with the God who created them. So I started to be confronted with all this contrary information to what I was brought up with and what I was trained in. And so I had to really wrestle with that. And as I wrestled with it, I began to see, yeah, I think this is what's going on here. And if you just read the prophets, the primary metaphor for idolatry is marital unfaithfulness. If you look at Hosea, it's pretty racy. Ezekiel 16 is just downright metaphorically explicit what the people of God were doing in idolatry, and it relates it to sexuality. So as I look at that, I think if it's inappropriate to have the Song of Songs, then it's inappropriate to have Ezekiel 16. It's inappropriate to have Hosea. It's inappropriate to have these other places where sexuality is spoken of metaphorically. So it's not a reach at all. In fact, I think it fits quite beautifully.
I wonder
That's really good.
Sorry, Tyler. Well, let me say one thing really quick. I wonder if, well, two things. If I remember my church history correctly, which I could be wrong, and you can remind me of this, it seems like everyone, or at least most scholars up until the 20th century, would have seen it like that. There was something weird in the mid 20th century, I don't know, 20s and on, maybe 50s, I don't know. But like Charles Spurgeon, who we'd all look to and go, hey, that guy was a good preacher, would have seen it that way. It's not like this isn't outlandish. It's not like, oh man, nobody saw it like this. So I think that's important to remember. And I also think it's important to remember, and I actually, maybe there's a question for you. I wonder if even reading it as a metaphor is more difficult these days because of our sexualized or pornified culture that actually brings in, like, there's shame involved even in intimacy, that we say, no, the Lord you can't equate those things. Whereas intimacy, I think, in a marital way, is supposed to represent the depth and the profoundness of love, as opposed to just an act. I mean, am I right in that?
I think you're so right. I mean, on the first thing that you said, the most commented on book of the Bible, the scholars and the church fathers all the way on up, the book of the Bible that has more commentaries than any other book of the Bible is the Song of Songs.
Mm.
That tells you something.
Yeah.
Maybe we just got really smart in the last 100 years. That would be pretty arrogant. So yeah, that's definitely there. And I think there is something to that we have such an unhealthy view of sexuality that we just say, no, that's something that's just, kind of dirty. I mean, it goes back to even like purity culture kind of stuff is so rampant in the church. So
Mm.
in one sense, of course, that's how people began to contextualize it. Um, and then the other thing is when you see it, what I was kind of trained up in some ways was looking at it as this progression of courtship and then dating and then marriage. And it was like this manual for male female relationship. Just hermeneutically, if you just read through it, that just, it doesn't even make sense to look at it that way. You have to do a lot of uh, hermeneutical gymnastics to get the text to fit some sort of a process oriented manual on what it means to be in relationship. Um, but I think that's another problem of modernity is not just the over sexualization, but also how we want to make everything in the Bible a manual or a how to kind of book. And that makes me sad that to the degree that the song speaks of male female relationship, we've even stripped that down from the Song of Songs to not let it speak as intimately and profoundly as I think it does.
You, Tyler, do you have a question? Because I have another question if you're
No, go ahead,
maybe.
fire away.
You mentioned, and I read this in your book, and I really do hope that people, that if you're listening to this podcast, and if you were there on Sunday, you do read Ted's book, Living as the Beloved. One of the things that I think I've heard you say this a number of times that I think is really important. You did mention it on Sunday. I'd love for you to just expound upon it a little bit. The progression of the refrain that is given throughout the Song of Songs. I think this happens 3 times. It's I think she says something like I am I am your, or I am, you say it. I don't, there's 3 things, but it progresses in intimacy. It's like at one point she's maybe a little bit timid, and then she says it again in the middle, and she's less timid. In the end, she's just fully like, I'm yours. Like, this is what it is. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's in chapter 2 where she says, "My beloved is mine and I am his." Beautiful picture of mutuality. We belong to each other, kind of a thing, right? So it starts there in the first, quarter of the song, and then it progresses in chapter 6 to "I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine." So a little bit more intensity of intimacy. So yeah, I am my beloved is mine. It's same kind of concept, but it kind of switches it around. And then the last one, where it's shifted a little bit more, is at the end of chapter 7. I am my beloved's and his desire is for me. And so the shift there in that deeper place of intimacy is to where she's not even thinking of possessing him in a sense, but being totally possessed by the lover. Like, I am his desire is for me. And it brings up for me the picture of self-forgetfulness, of just, this isn't even about me anymore. I am so just lost in this relationship in a beautiful, right way. And it's interesting that over the years, different writers have talked about this idea of self-forgetfulness as being a place of deep maturity with the Lord.
Yeah.
I wonder if some, for those listening, even some kind of actionable things from some of the things that you guys just shared, this idea of maybe being uncomfortable with the Song of Songs being read as metaphor. If you find yourself in that place still of like, man, I just don't know, I would encourage you, and Ted, you mentioned it, but I would encourage anyone who's a little bit uncomfortable with that to read Ezekiel 16. And it's very clear, the metaphor that God is using, and it's very explicit. It's a little bit of a slap in the face, or cold water in the face in some ways. So I'd encourage you to spend some time wrestling with the Lord with that. And then I wonder if, and maybe Ted, you could speak to this too, but in that vein of the Song of Songs, kind of being culturally read now with a little bit of, or a lot of uncomfortability just because of our pornified culture. I wonder if one of the redemptive values of this book is that as we understand the metaphor and we understand what God is doing there, we allow it to be a counter formation to our view of sex and sexuality. It's something that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, but that John Mark Comer says is all Christian formation is counter formation. And I wonder if a redemptive value of the book of Songs today for us is that it can counterform us back into those who even allow ourselves to be loved by God through stripping away some of the uncomfortableness with that intimacy.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that's part of the beauty, is that if we can see that God is using sexual intimacy as a metaphor for the deep intimacy we have with him, then we can really begin to even more fully embrace human sexuality as just a beautiful gift from God. And not, and so I think if we're feeling resistance around that, we're probably normal, because most of us have been malformed when it comes to the way we interact with our own sexuality. And so if we're feeling some resistance, you don't have to feel bad about that or shame around that. Just realize that, well, of course, if you grew up in this world, you're gonna have some resistance perhaps to that. And so to just maybe sit with that in prayer and say, Lord, what do you want me to notice? What maybe is some work you want to do in my heart, or some healing, some redemption as it relates to how I've interacted with human sexuality that has actually made it difficult for me to think about intimacy with you.
Yeah, that's good. I wonder, if someone listening, even pray through, read through Song of Psalms or Song of Songs, and when you feel that resistance, that might be an invitation to stop there and pray through whatever that verse is, whatever that metaphor is, whatever that concept is, to sit with the Lord and go, why am I so resistant to this? And just work with him on that. So
that's good. I do, as you were talking, both of you guys, I do want to, I'd love for you to just maybe briefly, go back to something you said again on Sunday. It seems like the progression. So if we think about human sexuality, even our culture that we live in that exploits it, it's oftentimes seen as an act or a recreation, maybe, as opposed to what I think the Song of Songs is explaining it to be, which is somebody who is dealing with some shame, maybe some insecurity, maybe some, not like a lack of understanding of the actual love that is lavished upon her by the lover. And as she deepens in that relationship, there's some ebbs and flows to it of not understanding, seeing the love differently, grieving or lamenting over the loss of some of the experience of the love at times, a desire for more of what she's experienced in the past. And really, it's just a depth of understanding of how much she is adored, how much she is loved, how much shame goes away as she understands more about the love, that her nakedness is no longer a problem at some point, because she's just aware of how much she's loved. Which we can speak to that in terms of human sexuality and say, hey, actually love is not just simply an act. It's a commitment or a experience of intimacy with the one that loves you. But when it comes to the Lord and our spiritual formation and growth, I wonder if you could just speak to maybe even the parallels between the Song of Songs itself and maybe just even the journey that the Lord might even have us on in terms of knowing him and experiencing his love for us.
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind is that, and I think you've read this book, Jason, Teresa of Avila, who was basically 16th century reformer in the Catholic Church. A lot of times people just think about the Reformation as being Protestant, but there was a Reformation happening in the Catholic Church basically at the same time. So when Luther and Calvin were doing their thing, you'd have Teresa, John of the Cross, and others, kind of basically similar time saying, yeah, there needs to be Reformation here, but they just did it within the Catholic Church. But anyway, Teresa of Avila really picked up on some of these themes of betrothal and wedding and union in her book, The Interior Castle. And our friend Tom Ashbrook kind of modernized that in a book called Mansions of the Heart.
Yeah, it's great.
It talks about there being two halves to the spiritual journey. And the way that Teresa talked about that was the first half of the journey is like, to put it in our context, birth to 18 years old, where you're a child, you're learning how to tie your shoes, you're learning how the world works, you're learning how to feed yourself, and you have parents that are very much holding your hand and helping you learn how to become a mature adult who can live in the world and contribute to the world in fruitful ways. And so that's kind of the goal of raising up children. And so she makes the comment that that's what it's like to be young in Christ, is that the Lord is leading you and shaping you so that you can then grow to a place of maturity and be discipled to a place where you can be a fruitful part of the kingdom of God. And that's the first half, or that's the task in the first half of the journey.
That would include like learning right and wrong, saying I need to, this is how I should live, this is how I shouldn't live. All that kind of stuff is in
all that stuff. Yeah. You treat people with respect. You don't lie. You don't put your hand on a hot stove. I mean, all that kind of stuff that you learn. And then the task of the second half of life is to fall in love. And so in the mansions, the first three set of mansions are that first part of life, and then 4, 5, 6, 7 are basically starting to notice love and be drawn into that. And in our human experience, there's probably a little bit of overlap between those two, but you're starting to notice love. You're starting to be drawn into it. There's kind of a commitment, a betrothal, to put it in the language of the old days. And then there's a place of union that comes, and it's just then a deepening place. And I think part of the challenge that the modern church has experienced is you can kind of program and put into curriculum what it means to be a responsible member of the church, learning how to use your spiritual gifts, learning the scriptures, learning just those basic, wonderful, beautiful things. But then how do you teach someone to fall in love? You can't really teach that. You can't program it. You can't make it happen. But you can walk with people as the Lord is drawing them into these deep places. So I think on our spiritual journeys, part of what it can be helpful to do is notice when the Lord is drawing us to a deeper place of intimacy with Him. And I say deeper place because you're experiencing, when you enter into and you begin this relationship with God, you have an intimacy with Him. You have union with Him. But your experience of it goes deeper and deeper over time. And it's like, how do you teach a 6-year-old about sexuality, human sexuality? Well, you're not going to be real graphic, right? But you better start teaching them, at that young age, that this is something that happens, and if you got too graphic about it, the 6-year-old would just run out of the room and, curse their mother and father and say, I can't believe you would ever do something like that,
Yeah. Yep.
But in the church, I think we begin to help even young believers with the language of the Lord has brought you to himself for intimacy, and what that looks like and how that is lived out gets explored a little bit further along in the journey.
So we just got a couple minutes left here, but as you talked about that, Ted, what came to mind was actually that I think, at least in our context, and I don't know about your experience, but many people would actually describe the opposite experience as far as their intimacy with God. It's going in the opposite direction, which would be at one point they might use language like I was on fire. I was, I was really passionate about my faith, and now things have cooled. And now maybe I want to get back to that. And this might be connected in some ways. You quoted Miser Eckhart, that God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by the process of subtraction. Perhaps by all that we've added, we've lost some of that. But maybe just kind of in closing here, I guess my question would be, if someone's listening and they find themselves, they resonate with that. Yeah, at one point I was really on fire. My love for God felt passionate, and now it's cooled. What does it look like to reverse that trend? How do we come back to the love of God in some ways and capture that again?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you were asking the question, I was thinking that I think that is often people's experience when they first come to know Christ. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this is incredible! God loves me," and there's that sense of um, uh, passion or um, uh, desire, and everything's new and it's exciting. Um, and I think what can sometimes happen is we get into kind of the daily rhythms of serving, the daily rhythms of what it means to follow Christ, um, and some of that can wax and wane just as a normal uh, part of things. Um, and sometimes it's because we've gotten too busy. I think sometimes we think about uh, like I think about, the reason that I think I followed the Lord into vocational ministry and even went to seminary and training and all that is because of my love for him. And then in some ways, my love for him shifted and changed because I was so busy trying to learn about him. And that's definitely important, to immerse yourself in the scriptures, to be trained, all those kind of things. But there's probably multiple reasons why someone could be in that place. And I think it's just to stop and maybe sit with someone else and just pray together. And what is the Lord inviting? I think the temptation can be, because, think about in Revelation where it says you've lost your first love. And and it says, go back and do the things that you did before. And the temptation can be, well, what was I doing as a new believer? I need to go back and do that stuff. And we can kind of cycle back through and try to recapture the magic in a way. And I think a lot of times when you feel like you've lost that, it's an invitation to go deeper with the Lord. And so that might be something to notice. Lord, are you inviting me into something deeper here? Are there some maybe new spiritual practices? Are there some things to let go of? Because I think, especially as we're growing in the faith, we can become quite attached to the way we're doing things, and even attached to praise we get for serving or using our gifts. And so, Lord, are there some things to let go? So those are just a few things I'd throw out there.
Yeah. Do you have, real quick, in about 30 seconds, because I want to make sure we say goodbye to you. We only have a few minutes left, but do you have any, I know that like Henry Nouwen's book, oh man, what's his book about silence and solitude?
The way of the heart.
Yeah, The Way of the Heart. Are there any other books like that? I mean, that's a really short book. It's an easy read, but are there other books like that might be helpful for people to be thinking through maybe some other spiritual practices like that?
There's a book by Rich Viotis called The Deeply Formed Life that I think is a great introduction. Uh, John Mark Comer, I think we referenced him, if not on the podcast before we got on. But he has a book about hurry that is a great introduction. I think it's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which is just excellent. And it'll open the eyes as it relates to just how we can get stuck in these cycles of busyness. And really, we have to learn how to slow down so that we can notice what's already there and what's already happening. And that I think in many ways is at the core of all spiritual practices, is to slow down and to notice.
I wish that we could, I mean, I could probably talk to you for another, I don't know, 45 minutes about some of these things. Because I'd love for you, we don't have time, but I'd love for you to talk about awareness and noticing and what it looks like to just stop and slow down. Maybe we'll have you on the podcast again, just because I'd love to pick your brain a little bit more. But we've taken enough of your time. So yeah, this has been so good. This has been a great conversation. I'm really hoping if you're listening to this, that it kind of stirs up your heart and mind for the Lord. Stirs up your heart and mind to dig in a little bit, to notice Him. Tyler was mentioning earlier, your illustration of the hidden driveway. Where is God right now? What's He doing? I just want to be aware and notice what He's up to, and see Him. And maybe through the Song of Songs, if you haven't read it because you've been scared of it, maybe you're not scared of it anymore. So I would really hope that would be the case. So, yeah. So, Ted, thanks so much, man. It's been great to have you. Tyler, I'll let you close it out, but I just wanted to make sure I said that.
No, I'll just echo the thank you. Thank you, Ted. You've served us well on Sunday, served us well here on this conversation, and super grateful for your insight and and just sharing your relationship with the Lord with us. It's great.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. It's been a joy to share with you guys.
All right. And we'll see everyone on Sunday. Thanks, everyone.